So our next speaker is a gentleman who spoke for us a couple of years ago and had a really big effect on many people, because Mark Devlin is a DJ, but more than that. He is a truth seeker, he is a writer, and his book, which has just come out this year, Musical Truth, is very well researched, very well written, and contains stuff that I think you could easily say was controversial. Because we all know the media manipulates, we all know that there are hidden messages, and yet, what about the world of art? What about the world of music? And it turns out the more you look, you also find manipulation there. So we're really looking forward today to hearing what Mark's got to reveal to us, and we may never hear music again in the same way. So please, a round of applause for Mark Devlin.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Andy. It's great to be back. As Andy mentioned, I was a speaker here in 2014. Some of you may have been present then. And I was a punter for quite a few years at the symposium as well. I used to come just to take in the talks. So it's great to be up here and get the opportunity to deliver one. As Andy mentioned, the main thing which has happened since I was here in 2014 is that I've put out my book. I self-published it earlier this year. It's called Musical Truth. There's copies out there on the merchandise table. And I want to share with you today some of the content that is in the book. And it's the culmination of 5 years' worth of research into the true nature of the corporate music industry and the groups and the networks that really control these institutions. So I'm talking about the very upper levels of the music industry. This would be household names, celebrities that we all know. I'm certainly not talking about every level of the music game, but the really nefarious, malevolent stuff goes on at the very upper levels. The book is 170,000 words over 536 pages. So if I presented the whole thing to you, we'd be here till about Tuesday. So I've had to be very selective in terms of what I give to you today. And I've selected a couple of themes that I explore in the book, which will hopefully make some sense, and then I'll be trying to wrap it all up towards the end and put it into some positive context, because some of it is a bit dark and dangerous. So it's all about stuff that goes on beneath the glossy surface veneer that we all see when it comes to these names that we all recognize. And it ties into the bigger picture of what's really going on in the world and who's really running all the other aspects of our daily lives. The entertainment industry, which would be the music game, Hollywood movies, and the television industry primarily, is just one part of the big picture, one spoke in the wheel, if you like. And that spoke alone goes very, very deep. So when I started looking into some of the stuff that we're not necessarily supposed to know about, there were a number of themes which cropped up time and time again in the backstory of the music industry in both the United States and the UK. There's a bit of blurb on the back of my book where I say, to most people, the music industry represents a source of harmless fun and entertainment. And that's what most of us think of when it comes to music, when it comes to the bands and the acts that we're all familiar with. It's supposed to be about forgetting all your stresses and strains and all your worries, letting your hair down, having a bit of fun, and enjoying yourself. If that were really the case, why would any of these elements be present in the backstory of the industry? So we have a bunch of unsettling connections, and as I say, these things are interwoven in the story of what happens and what has been happening for several decades. Trauma-based mind control and satanic ritual abuse, Satanism and dark occult rituals, pedophilia, the dark influence of Saturn is everywhere, particularly in the symbolism, as we'll see, the occult teachings of the notorious Aleister Crowley, who is a fellow I'm sure most of us are familiar with, suicides, in inverted commas, and overdoses, a whole bunch of them, and very crucially, connections into the world of military intelligence. So primarily agencies like the CIA and MI5 and MI6 and a few others. So part one is all about how these connections tie in. And we're going way back. Here's a very young Cliff Richard, who's a guy who's been in the news this year, as I'm sure you're aware. in some quite unsettling kind of circumstances, which cast quite a different light on his public persona to the one that we've been trained and conditioned to think of over the years. And here is Jimmy Savile. Of course, you couldn't do this story justice without bringing him in, because his influence is everywhere as well, particularly in those early days. I think we know enough about Savile and what he got up to not need to recap on it. But it's an interesting image because he appears to be hypnotizing Cliff Richard with a pendulum. And when you get into areas of mind control in the industry, there could be a little more to that image than meets the eye. Nevertheless, there are lots of overlapping, synchronistic connections between a very motley assortment of figures going back to these early days of the British industry. Cliff Richard, it turns out, was closely associated with the Kray twins, these notorious gangsters from the East End of London that terrorized the 1960s. Both ended up going to jail for murder. And the public perception of the Krays is that they were basically gangsters and they were into criminal activities, money laundering and gambling and prostitution, that sort of thing. But there are many researchers that have uncovered a far darker side to the Krays, and they've suggested that they were in fact involved in the procurement of children to elite paedophile rings. And as I say, they themselves then turn out to be connected to many of the key players in those early days of the music industry in one way or another. So we have Cliff Richard, Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager, had connections into the Krays. A number of other early producers in the British industry did as well. A guy called Joe Meek, there was a guy called Robert Stigwood, and Kit Lambert, and a few others. Then, coming back to Savile, it turns out that, in fact, he was closely associated with all the prominent musicians of the 1960s. That included the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Don't have time to go deeply into those connections today, but there's lots more to know there. And also an association with Elvis Presley. Who knew that? When it comes to the background of many of these musicians, as I said, you get these ties going back into the world of military intelligence. Cliff Richard's father, for instance, worked for Thorn EMI, which, as well as being one of the prominent record labels in the 1950s and 60s, also had an arm to its business that was all about weapons research and defense systems on behalf of the military. And it turns out a number of record labels also had divisions that dealt with those kind of activities, such as Decca, Capitol Records, and Parlophone. So Cliff Richard's dad was involved in that kind of work. When it comes to Elvis Presley, many researchers have dug into his true nature and gone beyond just the fact that he was a musician, have uncovered links to the CIA, to various police departments in certain US cities, and to the Drug Enforcement Agency. And the implication is that Elvis, as well as being a well-known musician, or arguably the biggest star of his day, was also involved in undercover surveillance work on behalf of these various agencies. This brings us to a very interesting concept, and it's one which I've been looking at big time since I published the book earlier this year. It's the concept of lifetime actors. Lifetime actors are people that have a certain public persona, a certain image that we all think of when their name is raised, and they spend pretty much their entire life masquerading under this kind of identity. But when you do the research and when you go digging and delving and when you do things like get hold of certain key documents under Freedom of Information Act releases, you can discover some very interesting things. So you could say that Elvis Presley was an example of a lifetime actor, given that he's thought of primarily as a musician, but as I mentioned, there's all these other links going on there as well. And incidentally, a theme which I discuss in the book is the idea that certain artists who we think of as having met their demise at a very young age may not actually have died after all, and things may not have happened the way the mainstream media told us. That'd be a first, wouldn't it? So Elvis Presley, we're told, died at the age of 42 on the bog in Gracelands in 1977. But there are many who think that he never actually died and that he was inducted into some kind of like a witness protection program so that he could continue his activities in a very covert way. And he's not the only musician who has suggestions like that linked to them. We'll meet a couple more as we go on. So here we have Wurzel Gummidge, Bob Geldof. And he would be another good example of a lifetime actor, because ostensibly he's thought of as the front man of the Boomtown Rats, bloody awful singer, but he seems to have made it anyway. And of course the front man for the Live Aid and Band Aid charities. In recent years, there's been a lot of research into the true nature of many of these prominent charities and their real activities and some of the stuff that they invest in and how much of the money that they raise actually goes to any practical, tangible good on the ground. And Band Aid and Live Aid have been scrutinized along with many other well-known charities. So that raises some questions about what the true nature of Bob Geldof might be. It turns out he's half Jewish, which is a surprise to many. And what you often find with many of these prominent celebrities is that the bloodline from which they emanate genealogically is deemed very important to the agenda of the elite ruling class. And you get these people that are ushered into positions of prominence by way of the bloodline that they come from because they've been singled out to do some work for the system. And they masquerade under a public persona to get them familiar in the public mind. So everyone sees this guy and they think, yeah, that's Bob Geldof, I know what he's all about. Geldof has been involved with various activities in Africa which are linked to the United Nations Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030 programs, which, when you really get down to it, are very much tied into eugenics and depopulation, and there's lots of nefarious stuff going on there. He was also wheeled out a couple of years ago as the public face for smart meters when they were trying to really get the public used to the idea of having a smart meter in your home. They decided they needed a celebrity to get up there and say, this would be a good idea, we should all have one. So this guy was chosen for the job. And then more recently, you might have seen him ranting and raving on a riverboat in the Thames, trying to encourage everyone to vote in the Brexit vote. So it seems to me that these people are given to us as musicians or as other types of celebrities, but the real reason for them having become famous was so that they could do their real work for the system. And I think Geldof would be a good example of that. And you can't really mention him without, in the same breath, bringing up his mate Bono. And they say you can judge a man by the company that he keeps. So what does it say about Bono that he's hobnobbing with village idiot Bush, Barry Soetoro? Actually, Obama is another great example of a lifetime actor while we're on the subject. People may have seen footage of him with a teleprompter either side of him whenever he delivers a public talk. So you see him turning from side to side as he talks. He's reading the screen. And there's a hilarious piece of footage where one time his teleprompter screen collapsed in the middle of a talk and he could not continue because the guy is not speaking his own words. He's reading from a script. And when that script goes, he's finished. Lifetime actor. So here's Bono with Clinton, said by many to be the illegitimate son of Winston Churchill. That's one people might want to look into. Bill Gates would be another one. It would not surprise me if Bill Gates did not actually invent Microsoft. It would also not surprise me if Mark Zuckerberg was not really the brains and the inspiration behind Facebook. I think people like this are, again, given to us with a public cover story. Bill Gates is the Microsoft boss. Zuckerberg is the Facebook boss. But again, beneath the surface, they're doing a very different kind of work. And I think we're all familiar with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and they're similarly in Africa doing lots of work connected to eugenics and depopulation and vaccination programs and all of that. So that would appear to be Bill Gates's real job. And this would appear to be Bono's real job. So he was familiarized through being the front man of U2, bit better singer than Geldof, arguably. But here he is showing his true colors and hobnobbing with all the usual suspects. Mass murdering psychopathic war criminal Tony Blair. And this is key to a lot as well. Knighthoods. rewards for services rendered. Here's Bono proudly displaying his, with a nice piece of one-eye symbolism thrown in. And the strangest, most unexpected names turn up getting knighthoods, MBEs, OBEs, CBEs, rewards from the British Empire. This is Kate Bush. And I've long been a big fan of Kate Bush's music. I've always seen her as a wildly creative, independent, maverick artist that was putting herself out there and creating music that nobody else was. And she's made some fascinating songs about Wilhelm Reich and his orgonite technology and cloud busting, and she did a song about pi, the magical number of pi, all this esoteric stuff. So what the hell is going on when somebody like Kate Bush gladly accepts a CBE from her travesty? There she is, watching over us there. She is kind of the last person that I would have expected to want to be associated with the British Empire, which, let's be honest, is all about conquering foreign nations and plundering resources and putting down populations, wiping out entire populations, you know, all of that. Not something you might expect a maverick creative artist to want to be associated with. And it leads you to the suspicion that every prominent major artist out there is ultimately controlled and manipulated and directed by the system, by the powers that be. And that's why we get this sort of thing happening. Here's another one. He cropped up in one of the talks yesterday. Damon Albarn of Blur and Gorillaz. A few years ago, he started to get very vocal about 9/11. I think he questioned the official story of 9/11 in certain interviews. And he started making comments about the government's policy on austerity and homelessness and stuff like that. So he appeared to be, again, an independent artist that could think with his own mind and was making these statements. But then what do we find early this year in the Queen's New Year's Honours list? Damon Albarn gets a bloody MBE. So once again, he's down with the programme. And it leads me to wonder whether they let these artists out there making these statements and putting out these messages to lead people to think that they're kind of on our side and that they're speaking for us and that they are independent and they can think for themselves and that they're not controlled. And in some way, that kind of disarms us and it takes us off our guard. And then at a later stage, these individuals reveal their true colours and we come to understand who really owns and controls them. I've seen this concept play out time and time again over the decades with so many acts, from the Beatles all the way through to the likes of Beyonce and Rihanna. There's definitely a blueprint and a template that goes on. There's more of that in the book, which I can't get into today. Then we have, this guy that's thought of as a bit of a wild man of rock, Noel Gallagher of Oasis. You're probably familiar with this event in 1997 when Blair was first manipulated into power. And there's a party where Gallagher was hobnobbing with Blair and all his cronies, sipping champagne and, getting up close and personal with him. And you could say, well, it was the spirit of the times, and in 1997, people didn't understand the true nature of Blair the way we do now. But just recently, a few months ago, in a newspaper interview, Gallagher was saying that he basically still supported Tony Blair and that he realizes his decisions on the Iraq war were unpopular, but he thought that he did the best he could in the circumstances and he still basically was a supporter. So where's the wild man of rock now? Where's that rebellion? Where's that anti-establishment spirit that we're supposed to think of our rock icons as having? Doesn't seem to be there. Russell Brand, what can you say? Anyone that still thinks Russell Brand is the real deal and is a people's revolutionary and is, vocalizing what we're all thinking and is articulating that, don't know what to tell you. There's so many warning signs and red flags when it comes to Russell Brand that, I don't know where to start. Here he is with his deeply mind-controlled wife, Katy Perry, who he was put with for a short while. This is another thing that happens, industry relationships. When you look at somebody like Beyonce and Jay-Z, for example, Russell Brand and Katy Perry, who really believes that these people get together through romantic love? They fall head over heels for each other. They see each other as their soulmates and they have to be together. all of it smacks to me of being arranged by the forces that control the industry. So these assets that they have are put together in partnerships and pairings because it suits the agenda to have these individuals together for a short period. And then when it's done, they go their separate ways, such as Brand and Katy Perry. And here he is meeting her travesty once again. A guy whose work I certainly recommend a look at when it comes to discovering the true nature of a lot of cultural heroes and icons. So not just musicians now, but other people that have entered the domain of popular culture and are names that we all recognize, and in many cases are people that are revered and put up on a pedestal, is Jan Irvin, who runs a site called Gnostic Media, gnosticmedia.com. He's done a lot of great research into primarily the influence of the CIA in all these areas. And he's got a podcast series with a musicologist by the name of Dr. Hans Utter, looking into many interesting things there. And also another series called Unspun with a guy called Joseph Atwill. So anyone that really wants to delve into this subject, I thoroughly recommend going to Gnostic Media and having a delve through all of Jan Irvin's work. So one of his sort of pet subjects or bugbears is this guy by the name of Robert Gordon Warson. And he was pretty much credited with being a guru of psychedelic mushrooms. This guy went down to Mexico in the 1950s and is said to have done a whole load of research into the hallucinogenic effects of certain breeds of mushroom. And then he came back to the United States and shared his findings and tried to popularize the use of psychedelic mushrooms in culture. So the cover story here is that this is just this guy that discovered this wonderful thing and altruistically wished to share it with everyone else. But Jan Irvin has shown how this famous trip that he went to Mexico, which was chronicled on the cover of Life magazine in 1957 in a very famous article, was not only commissioned by the CIA, but there's documentation now available to show that the CIA paid for the entire trip. So what the hell was their influence doing there if this guy was all about helping us to expand our minds? Another fella along similar lines is Terence McKenna, very much connected with psychedelic compounds, very much seen as someone that wanted to help young people explore their consciousness and go on these amazing journeys of self-discovery. Turns out Terence McKenna had links to the CIA as well and would appear to have been an asset of them. I was in Glastonbury yesterday, actually, in the high street, and I went into a bookshop, and there was a whole shelf all about hallucinogenics and the LSD era. And there were books on all these characters: Gordon Warson, Terence McKenna, this guy, Dr. Timothy Leary, the acid guru. And all these books were talking about how these were cultural heroes and they were, you know, very important figures of their time. And I had a quick flick through all these books. No mention of any CIA involvement there at all, or any links back into the military. But there is documentation now available through the work of researchers to show that this was the case. But it's suspiciously missing from the public record. So Dr. Timothy Leary was this groovy kind of Harvard professor who is said to have discovered the wonderful effects of LSD, which just emerged out of nowhere in the 1960s, and started putting this stuff out to all these gatherings of hippies in these various communities. And he seemed to have an endless supply of the stuff. You know, cooking up acid was a costly business, but Leary had no problem in getting hold of it. So then it turns out through interviews and his own admission in latter years that Timothy Leary was also an asset of the CIA and in its employ. So you've got to ask yourself, what interest would the CIA have in large numbers of young people in that very key period in the 1960s when there was so much social change going on elsewhere, getting out of their minds on acid and tripping out, listening to psychedelic rock music and keeping themselves away from any kind of political activism or any kind of involvement in anything tangible. At the time, the Vietnam War was raging, was deeply unpopular, but you had a large number of kids that had been turned onto acid that perhaps might otherwise have been engaged in some sort of anti-war activism that were instead just, you know, getting off their tits on LSD. Another very important group of that era, very much linked to the whole LSD scene, was a group called the Grateful Dead. Very interesting backgrounds here as well, because the road manager for the Grateful Dead was a guy by the name of Alan Trist. Alan Trist's father was Eric Trist, who was the founder of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London, which is this kind of think tank organization, which is all about social engineering, cultural Marxism, and mind controlling of large numbers of people through manipulating culture, culture creation. That's what institutions like the Tavistock and the Frankfurt School and Stanford University in the United States, and from what I hear, certain factions of Cambridge University in the UK through the ages have been involved with. So more to know about the Grateful Dead. Another character was Ken Kesey. I saw a book on him yesterday as well. He had this little community called the Merry Pranksters, and they would go around in this brightly coloured psychedelic bus around all the areas of California where these hippie communities were gathering in the 1960s, again, giving out free tabs of LSD. Where did it all come from? Who was paying for it? Ken Kesey, can you guess? Turned out to have been an asset of the CIA also, and probably a mind control subject coming out of the whole MK Ultra program as well. This fella has done a lot of amazing work into the backgrounds of so many of the prominent musicians who came out of the Laurel Canyon district of Los Angeles, up in the Hollywood Hills, in the mid to late 1960s. So this is the counterculture era, tying in chronologically with the launch of LSD and the Vietnam War and all these other social changes. So a great many of the artists associated with the folk rock scene of those times just seemed to congregate out of nowhere in this one particular area known as Laurel Canyon. And McGowan detailed his findings in this amazing book, awesome, thoroughly recommend it, called Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. Unfortunately, Dave McGowan passed away last year on the 22nd of November of cancer, apparently, so a very sad loss. But he left behind this amazing work. And so he details the family backgrounds of pretty much all the prominent musicians that came out of that scene. So there's John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. And remember I mentioned at the start there are links going into satanic ritual abuse and paedophilia everywhere you look, unfortunately. Mackenzie Phillips, who he named after Scott Mackenzie, who wrote the hippie anthem San Francisco, Be Sure to Wear Some Flowers in Your Hair, in her 2009 autobiography, revealed that her father raped her on the eve of her marriage. That was the claim she made against John Phillips. And there's a lot more to know about this guy as well, and it all ties into those elements that I detailed at the start of the talk. All these things that you wouldn't expect to find in the music industry, but they crop up time and time again anyway. The other prominent member of Mamas and the Papas was Mama Cass Elliot. She just happened to turn up dead in 1974, allegedly of an overdose. There's another one of those. In a flat in London, which was owned by Harry Nilsson of Without You fame and many other songs. And she wasn't the only musician to turn up dead in that very flat, because 4 years later, 1978, Keith Moon, drummer with The Who, also happened to turn up dead in Harry Nilsson's flat in London of an overdose. Lots of strange stuff to know. But staying with Laurel Canyon, the classic example of an artist who would appear to be not all that we think he is, would be Jim Morrison, frontman of The Doors. Here he is on the deck of a ship which was commanded by his father, looking very different to the iconic rock god image that we all have in our minds of Jim Morrison. Here he is, Admiral George Stephen Morrison. And McGowan revealed that this guy just happened to be the naval commander in charge of the fleet of ships involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which springboarded the US into the Vietnam War. So you don't find a stranger juxtaposition between father and son than between Jim Morrison and his dad. Here's the image we all have of Morrison, this rebellious rock icon, supposed to be all about sticking it to the man and anti-war and all of that. And his dad basically started the Vietnam War. How do you even reconcile those things? Frank Zappa, another one. His father, it turns out, was a chemical weapons research guy involved in bioweapons coming out of the Edgewood Arsenal military base, and Zappa was actually born there. And the examples go on and on and on. For pretty much every prominent music maker that you could select from those times. There are family connections. Again, it's the family link, bloodlines, going into military intelligence circles. If it's not the CIA, then it's the Pentagon, then it's the Marines, the Army, various other aspects of government. Another very interesting story, before we move on, involves this guy, or sorry, his dad actually, who was a big-time CIA man, career CIA operative by the name of Miles Copeland, involved for decades from the formation of the CIA from the OSS going forward. And he had 3 sons. And one of his sons was this guy, Miles Copeland Jr., not very imaginative with naming their kids, these Americans, are they? So he started a company called International Record Syndicate. And you can see the initials there on his T-shirt. And the initials break down as IRS, interestingly. The second son was Ian Copeland, and he got involved in the music industry as well. He had a company called Frontier Booking International. When you break down the initials, you get FBI. And then the third son was Stuart Copeland of the group The Police. So you have a career CIA man with sons who found the IRS, the FBI, and the police. Are they trying to tell us something? As we move on, you'll see I get into the concept of placing the truth right there in plain sight. This is David Crosby of the Byrds, of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. This is a record industry insider by the name of John Todd. It's a fascinating anecdote. I don't think I've got time to go into it today. It's in the book, but I'll have to skip over it for now, but it's amazing stuff. Other cultural events that were happening in the 1960s at the same time as the Vietnam War, at the same time as the psychedelic era, at the same time as the emergence of LSD and magic mushrooms, which traumatized pretty much that generation of the American public, included the Manson family murders of 1969, this infamous event, very much synchronistically tied in with all the key movers and shakers of the music industry. As was this organization, Anton LaVey's Church of Satan, founded in 1966, a very key year to all this stuff. You come to realize that the powers that are controlling the corporate music industry, Hollywood, and everything else are dark occultists in their true nature. It's a dark religious priest class that employ various rituals, and they're very much steeped in Satanism, Luciferianism, and other, dark activities. So a lot of people, when you expose all the shenanigans that go on in the music industry and all these strange deaths of artists very young, will tell you that it's all about corporate greed. It's just corporations wanting to make money out of these artists. They knock them off every now and again because a dead artist is worth more to a corporation than a live one. That's certainly an aspect to it. But for me, from what I've come to discover, ultimately what's going on is dark occult ritualistic practices by this group who are obsessed with, these type of behaviors. So another institution very similar to the Church of Satan was the Process Church of the Final Judgment, coming out of San Francisco in the 1960s. There are links between the Process Church and a whole bunch of music makers. Charles Manson, David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, serial killer, was connected with the Process. Sirhan Sirhan, said to be the assassin of Robert Kennedy, had ties to the Process Church as well. And so did Paul McCartney. But which one? The largest chapter in my book is 15,000 words on the very far-reaching theory that the fellow we think of in the world today as Paul McCartney is not the original James Paul McCartney, but that in 1966, in one circumstance or another, the real McCartney died and was replaced. I'm not going to get into that one today because I think the symposium finishes at 10 o'clock tonight and not halfway through Wednesday. But as I say, there are entire books on this subject. There's one by a guy called Dr. Nick Kollerstrom, which I certainly recommend, The Life and Death of Paul McCartney, 1942 to 1966. And there's a whole chapter in my book as well. But for the purposes of today, I'll just leave you with this one image and ask yourself if that is 2 pictures of the same man or if you're looking at 2 different people. The Rolling Stones, for every esoteric, occult kind of link between the Beatles and all these other aspects of stuff that was going on. You can find 10 times as many with the Rolling Stones. Many researchers think that not only were the Beatles a product of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, but that the Rolling Stones came out of that very same camp as well. And there's certainly a lot of evidence to back that up. Here's a famous album of theirs called Their Satanic Majesty's Request. Is it a reference to her? I don't know. And here he is. You can't do one of these presentations without a cameo from Aleister Crowley and his various teachings through the secret societies that he helmed up, all these mystery schools like the OTO, very deeply connected into the rock music world. Also the AA and the Order of the Golden Dawn and all of that. Many, many music makers through the ages have held a deep fascination and reveration for the works of Aleister Crowley. A filmmaker emerging out of that same 1960s era, who again had connections into the Rolling Stones, the Process Church, and was also obsessed with the teachings of Aleister Crowley, was a guy by the name of Kenneth Anger. He put out two very striking, very potent short films in the 1960s and 70s. One was called Invocation of My Demon Brother, and the other one was called Lucifer Rising. And this is a still from Lucifer Rising with Marianne Faithfull, Rolling Stones insider, something kind of mind control groupie. So again, the question remains, if the music industry is all about fun and having a laugh, why are there connections into My Demon Brother and Satanism and Lucifer and the Church of Satan and all this stuff? So much more to know. Brian Jones was the founding member of the Rolling Stones. There are many parallels between him and Jim Morrison when it comes down to it. Brian Jones was discovered dead on the 3rd of July 1969 at the age of 27. Floating face down in the swimming pool of his country mansion. Jim Morrison is said to have died on the 3rd of July 1971, exactly 2 years later, and again at the age of 27. Anyone that was here for the speaker panel yesterday might recall that we touched briefly on the idea of the 27 Club. But interesting parallels there. And Jim Morrison, by the way, would be the other artist about whom most rumours persist that he never actually died and that his death was in some way a hoax. And I can certainly see how that could have been the case. Particularly with his family connections, which would have been able to pull off some kind of cover-up. Just an interesting picture here of Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones when he left a court case connected to a drugs bust in 1967. As he was leaving the court, there was a picture of his car snapped, and you might be able to make out that the last three figures on the license plate just happened to be 666. Which is an interesting number, and it crops up time and time again. There was a famous concert that the Rolling Stones performed at in Altamont, the racetrack in California in 1969, at which this youth that you can see highlighted by the arrow, a guy by the name of Meredith Hunter, was stabbed to death as the group performed on the stage. And it's led many to question whether it was some kind of dark occult ritual. In wrapping up this section, I don't feel I can put it better than a listener to one of my podcasts that got in touch by email to offer her view on what all this stuff means. And she said, I believe that this dark agenda revolved around not only getting the best and the brightest addicted to drugs and drink, loveless sex, and of course rock and roll, but that it was a carefully crafted campaign to undermine us at the deepest level of our spiritual core, complete disempowerment from which many of us are still reeling and thankfully bouncing back from. And this person was an original generation 60s music fan. So she's of an age where she has a lot of nostalgic investment in remembering the 60s as this wonderful time of enlightenment and cultural breakthroughs. But she's been able to see the information for what it is, and she's absorbed it, and truth is truth. Whoever likes it or whoever chooses to look at it. So she went on, who are the role models for young people today? Where are they? I can't think of a single one. Did they ever give us sound, legitimate role models of any integrity, or just actors behind shallow scripts like the fucking astronauts? That's another whole story. To keep the kiddies begging for the latest toy or junk food product. Exactly. Part 2, let's try and put some context into all this. Placing the truth in plain sight, a very important dynamic. Also tying into free will and consent. In the years leading up to 9/11, there were many, many depictions of the events that would come to pass on the 11th of September 2001, encoded into movies, TV shows, music videos, cartoons, comics. There are hundreds and hundreds of examples of this. This is just a very small select few. There are specific examples from the music industry. There's many images that I often show. I'm just going to show you this one today. From a Michael Jackson album, which came out in 1997, so 4 years before 9/11. Interesting symbology throughout. He's dancing on a Masonic black and white checkerboard floor. He's wearing the colours of Saturn, blood red. And something which I missed, you can see in the background, by the way, there's a city crumbling to dust in much the same way as we saw the towers doing on that infamous day. And something which I missed until somebody pointed it out to me, which just goes to show how the subconscious mind can absorb all sorts of stuff that you don't recognize until it's brought into the conscious mind, is if you look at his hands, and if you imagine they were superimposed on a clock face, you have one hand pointing towards where the 9 would be, and the other hand is pointing to the 11. That passed me by for years. And of course, the only way the predictive programming around 9/11 makes sense is if the same parties, ultimately, that were responsible for pulling off that event are the same parties or connected to the same parties that run all these institutions. The Hollywood movie scene, the music industry. How else can you explain this? Unless you're going to say that it's random chance and coincidence at odds of probably billions upon billions upon billions upon billions to one. But there are still people that put it down to that. Michael Jackson, lots of interesting symbology through the years that he's given us. Here's the highlighting of one eye. Here he is telling us to keep quiet about something, some big secret. What could that be, I wonder? Here he is doing this familiar hand sign. And here's a more modern day artist, Beyonce, giving us exactly the same thing. And here's a whole bunch of other faces you might recognize, a motley assortment. So what's going on here is the cover story is that it means, okay, it's cool. You see people doing this in everyday life. But for satanic secret societies and dark occult practitioners, it's got a different meaning. And it's the evocation of a 6, as in 666. So I told you we'd come back to that number. It crops up absolutely bloody everywhere. Dr. Dre, very rich man coming out of the world of hip-hop, has a headphone range called Beats by Dre. It's the most popular headphone range in the world. There's advertising literature which purports to show the 3 Bs, meaning beats, but actually when you put them together, what you get is another rendering of 666. Another interesting hand sign is this one. We see this the whole time. This one has a cover story as well. When the thumb is extended, it's supposed to mean I love you in deaf sign language. So you're supposed to be getting an I, an L, and a U. But, you know, are Hillary and Village Idiot Bush the sort of people that go around saying I love you? Or could there be more to know? Not really known for love and upliftment for all humanity, those guys, I'd suggest. So we're back to the Beatles, and here we have Lennon and McCartney, or is it, giving us those 2 symbols on the sleeve of Yellow Submarine. Isn't that interesting, way back in the day? Here's Eminem doing a different kind of rendering of that sign. And what it actually means within these circles is it's an homage to this entity known as Baphomet, which is a very important symbol in Satanism and various occult practices. And it seems to be very important to those that control and direct these industries. Another one is this triangular hand sign that we see Jay-Z and others flashing up the whole time. Here's Kanye West looking extremely mind-controlled, doing the same thing. And Jay-Z mentioned in an interview in 2009 that he'd invented that symbol, and it was supposed to be called the rock sign. And you get loads of his fans in concerts, upon instruction, flashing up this symbol. And I would bet that 99.9% of them have no idea what's actually going on. This symbol goes back way further. Here's Anton LaVey of the Church of Satan once again in the 1960s. But you'll find this particular symbol going back into ancient civilizations in different parts of the world. It's a part of the Indian mudra system of signing, among many others. So it's certainly no modern invention. And it appears to be another one that's very important to these occultists. In the context in which it's used most commonly, it's said to be a triangle of manifestation. And here's the one eye symbol that we see everywhere. Pretty much every prominent artist of the day in some way covering one eye and leaving the other one showing. Two symbols for the price of one, and another example of how things can be missed. So we got Shaka Khan, who had some very interesting things to say about the true nature of the industry upon the death of Whitney Houston, her good friend, in 2009. There's interviews where Shaka Khan describes the industry as demonic and stay away from it. She would be one to know. In this album sleeve, single sleeve from 1984, as well as the one eye thing, have a look at the hair. Encoded in the hair, you notice you have another 3 6s. Very similar to what you see in the logo to Disney and the National Lottery and Vodafone and a whole bunch of other companies. 666 everywhere you look. Mind control, trauma-based mind control, MK Ultra and its various derivatives such as monarch programming. A few years ago, Britney Spears went a bit crazy, shaved her hair off and started attacking cars with umbrellas. And everyone was asking themselves, what's going on? Why has she gone a bit crazy? Well, the answer is that endemic in the industry and also in Hollywood is this method of mind control very much tied in to the Disney Corporation, which is deeply satanic and very different, again, from its cuddly, fluffy persona when you get down to it. That's the reason why you see many artists pictured with, of all things, Mickey Mouse ears. The Mickey Mouse ears are a subliminal indicator of the presence of trauma-based mind control, which causes dissociative states in the minds of the victims and multiple personality disorder, whereby they take on a number of different personas, each of which can be programmed in a certain way. So coming out of the Mickey Mouse Club, part of Disney, we had Britney Spears, Justin Timberlake and Christina Aguilera in the same year. Many other artists pictured with Mickey Mouse ears. Here's Madonna, often referred to as the grand priestess of the industry, so no great surprise there. Marilyn Manson, well, you know, who's too surprised at that? A practicing priest within the Church of Satan, incidentally. The Church of Satan included in its ranks back in the 60s, Sammy Davis Jr. and Jane Mansfield. And then you have Marilyn Manson, and more recently, Mark Almond of Soft Cell is a part of that organization. Jessie J, not many British acts crop up in this story, but one does there. And another little visual hint at the presence of monarch programming specifically is the presence of this very distinctive colored butterfly, the monarch butterfly. Mariah Carey would appear to be another artist who has been subject to this type of programming. For no apparent reason, on this album the other year, she was pictured holding this butterfly. Why would that be? There's no apparent reason for it to be there, and it's by far from the only butterfly that you see in these contexts. We're reminded of a story from 2001 where Mariah went a bit crazy and apparently started rambling incoherently and eventually attempted to take her own life. And the mainstream press said, oh, she's had a bit of a breakdown, she's got to go into rehab. And then a few months later, she was back on the scene and, you know, making music again. Classic sign of the programming breaking down and having to go back in to have it dosed up. Nicki Minaj, what can you say? Barbie doll symbology is another strong indicator of the presence of mind control, and that's Nicki Minaj's whole persona. And talking about placing the truth in plain sight, here's the video to a song that she put out the other year called Out of My Mind. And she's in a straitjacket in a mental institution. It's not like they don't give us the opportunity to know. Just a few more symbols. The electronic dance music genre is arguably the most popular and most commercially successful genre of music all the way around the world now. One of its leading proponents is a German producer and DJ by the name of Paul van Dyk. For many years, he's had this very interesting symbol, and I've scratched my head trying to figure out what it was. Then I came across the symbol for British intelligence, it says here, MI5, and this just happens to be their logo, which I notice bears some similarity to this one here. Not that I'm suggesting there's intelligence links with that one, but when you put the two side by side, isn't it interesting how they correspond? Okay. So I've no idea why a German producer and DJ would be using a logo used by British intelligence, but the evidence is there. And he would appear to be not the only one. There's a Japanese dance music producer called Steve Aoki who appears to be employing the exact same logo. So you've got the pyramid thing going on, you've got the all-seeing eye in the capstone, you've got symbology to get into for days. So let's try and make sense of all of this and wrap it up and leave on a positive note as well, because as I acknowledged, a lot of that information is very dark. It has to be taken on board if we're going to overcome it in any way. It has to be acknowledged. It has to be faced up to. But you don't have to dwell in the darkness of it all, because the solutions lie here. Natural law, otherwise known as universal law, spiritual law, many different names, can be summed up very simply in the phrase, do no harm, but take no shit. So the do no harm bit is a moral code that we are required to live by the creative force behind the universe. And it dishes out karmic consequences according to whether we, through our free will consciousness, the greatest gift that we have as sentient conscious beings, to make decisions of morality for ourselves, whether we choose to live according to the law, do no harm, or whether we choose to go against it. You get a certain set of circumstances on both an individual basis and a collective basis if you choose to live by that rule, and you get a different set of circumstances if you think you can do better. And, you know, these results come to societies. When a society as a whole is not observing this basic rule, then the society as a whole reaps the outcome of it. It can be expanded as, do not treat others in a way you would not wish to be treated yourself. It's the golden rule, it's the simplest thing in the world, and you would think that it would be taught in schools, but it speaks volumes that it's not. And here's the key to what I think is going on. We're back full circle to Savile. A few years ago, he came out on a TV program wearing this sweatshirt, I am an animal and I will eat you if I have to. And the presenter said, what's all this, Jimmy? What does this mean? And he said, you must give them all fair warning, you see, with his usual bluster and bullshit, you know. But what he said was very key to what's going on, because it's my belief, and the belief of many other researchers in this area, that these occultists that we have running the show understand the concept of natural law. They understand that they're not supposed to do any harm. But if you give people a little visual indicator of your true nature, of what you're doing, or of what you plan to do, then you are gaining the tacit approval and the unspoken consent of the people that see that. Of course, people can't be reasonably expected to understand the true nature of what's to come when it's all encoded cryptically or numerologically. But nevertheless, the controllers in their sick, twisted mentality seem to feel that because they've communicated to us what they're all about, they're now off the hook and the onus is on us. That's why they do all this stuff. And when you take on board that concept, it makes sense of so many otherwise unanswered questions and solves so many of these mysteries about why all these symbols and things are put into popular culture. The key to it then is breaking free of the mind control spells that are being cast on us. We have to become symbol literate. We have to understand all the stuff that's going into this music, understand all the imagery that's going into Hollywood films and such. And when we come to these understandings, we take on an obligation to share that information with other people, because it needs to get out there as widely as possible, and large numbers of people need to come to these understandings. Aleister Crowley, of all people, a quote from his book of magic was, "Magic, with a K, is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will." So he's saying that our consciousness and our thoughts and our intent can actually shape the physical manifestations that we experience. So that can be done by a small group of dark occultists that want to control and enslave the rest of humanity. But this process can also be taken on by the rest of us that want to focus our will and our intent on a better deal for humanity and on turning things around and in upliftment and inspiration and a better deal for, you know, the next generation than the one we currently have. The process is waiting for anyone that wants to apply it. If not now, then when? If not you, then who? Love that phrase. Then we have one person can't change the world, but they can be an essential component in the process that does. So we can often feel disempowered. we look at all this madness that's going on in the world and we can think, well, there's nothing I can do to solve it. Well, to a certain extent, there's very little that any one individual can do. But imagine a situation where 10 million people are all sitting around saying, there's nothing I can do. Imagine if those people were all to come together to pool their consciousness and their positive intent and unite all on the same page, how quickly we could turn this situation around and get a better deal for everyone involved. And anyone can be a part of this process. You don't need to come from any educational background. You don't need letters after your name. Any one individual can be a part of the process that needs to take place. I think more and more are coming to this understanding, and this is going to be the undoing of this malevolent control system that we have. Everything I've spoken about today is in my book. There are copies of it out in the lobby on the merchandise table for anyone that wants to grab one. As I say, there's a whole bunch of subjects that I didn't have time to get into today, but I hope this has given you a flavour of the information that I present, and I hope it's left you with some kind of inspiration moving forward. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mark Devlin. Thank you.